Hi, I'm Jake. Welcome to the Blind Eternities Tavern. I think we all know that Magic the Gathering's most popular format is Commander, and they're making new precons for it all the time. And each one of those precons comes with a little pamphlet like this that explains how to play, how to build your deck, and how Commander Tax works. But it has something missing. It doesn't actually say that Commander is a 4-player game. Because it's not. You can play Commander with any number of people. But I think we've all had the experience of sitting down with 8 people at the table and having the game take 5 or 6 hours, with board wipes setting everybody back to square one. Well, I want to give a couple of other options. A couple of things you can do when you have a weird number of people show up, because we don't all have friend groups in multiples of 4. So pull up a chair and have a seat at the table, and whether you're a button mash hack and slash controller bash, or a meeple moving mastermind of maps, mats, and minis, if you ruffle at the awful riffle shuffle scuffle, or if you're a click clack pick attack number ball luck sack, we're all here for the same reason. I'm Jake, let's talk games. So I was putting together my Commander decks for Friday Night Magic last week, and I grabbed my Pauper Commander deck. For those of you who don't know, Pauper is a format where, in Commander at least, your Commander is an uncommon card, and the rest of your deck is entirely commons. The Pauper Commander that I choose to play is Araumi, the Dead Tide. Now, I really like this card because I like strategies that bring creatures back from the graveyard, but Araumi does it in a slightly different way. See, she doesn't bring creature cards back from the graveyard. In fact, she exiles them. But what she does do is bring back copies of creatures for every single opponent that you have. And at a regular table, that means every enter and leave effect of a creature in your graveyard can happen 3 times. So early on, with Araumi, that means something like Crow of Dark Tidings will mill 12 cards, plus the original 4 of this creature entering and leaving the battlefield. Cards like Sage's Road Denizen can proc a number of times as well, and you can rapidly fill up your graveyard. But I think you start to see the problem if you have too many or too few opponents. Because with only 1 or 2 opponents, this doesn't do a whole lot. And with too many opponents, well, I'm milling half my deck. And then with access to things like Teardrop Kami to reset it, cards like Sailor of Means and others to produce mana and get ahead in that regard, and cards like Grey Merchant of Asphodel, love a good Gary, you close out the game very quickly. So this deck doesn't really play well at other table sizes. It's pretty much geared for a pod of 4, and any more or fewer than that, the rules start to break down. And I know this isn't the only commander that has this problem. Any card with Encore or Myriad or any of these other effects that care about the number of opponents you have can get out of hand if the table's too big, or do nothing if the table's too small. Other cards have the reverse problem, and it used to be the case when you were playing casual, chaos, free-for-all Magic that you didn't know how big of a table that you'd be showing up for. But with Commander, it's become generally accepted that that table size is 4. But we don't all have friend groups in multiples of 4. And with that being the case, I wanted to talk about some other options we have to use our Commander decks in other pod sizes. So we're going to start small. And we're going to start by talking about what we can do when we are faced with a Commander pod of only 3 people. So when you're playing at a table of 3, I think we all naturally fall into the same general problem. And that's that as soon as one player starts getting ahead, the other 2 team up on them. And pretty much no matter how powerful your Commander deck is, it's not going to be able to play 2v1. So when you're stuck in that position of sitting at a table of 3, my recommendation is to play 2v1. And the best way to play with those uneven odds is to play Archenemy, which is a really fun format that allows one person to stand up against the rest of the table. The easy math on it is that whoever is the arch enemy starts with their life total plus half of the total of opponents that they are playing against. And then as the game progresses, every turn they draw one card off the top of the arch enemy deck. Most of these cards scale with the number of opponents they have, so this isn't explicitly a 3-player format, but I think it's a really cool way to even the odds and let one player live out their dreams of being the big bad guy. It's a whole lot of fun, and I think these cards are pretty easy to come by. They've made a few different arch enemy decks and pre-constructed things over the years, and usually they go for a pretty reasonable cost. So throw together a deck. You don't need a ton of cards. I think this is just 3 arch enemy decks shuffled together from the original release. But you only need about 15 or 20 because none of the games are going to go much longer than that. And you can have a whole lot of fun with even a regular Commander pod size. It's just a really cool format that plays really well with 3 people at the table. But I think there's a couple of other things that we can do, and they don't all require additional cards like this. Although I will say, I love a good game of Plane Chase, and it does tend to take a while when you're playing with a full pot of 4. So Plane Chase at 3 can also be a lot of fun. There's a few different ways to play Plane Chase, and I'll get to that in another video, but just as another alternative, things that change the battlefield and change the flow of the game work well when you have a weird pod with a weird number of players on it. The other thing you can do when you only have 3 players at the table is to play a sort of co-op game. There's a really cool format called Horde Magic, and I've heard different ways of constructing your Horde deck, but I think the most common, or at least most popular, is that you build a 100-card deck where 60 of the cards are tokens, and the other 40 are cards that care about creatures. This could be things like Gaia's Anthem that buff all the creatures you control, or other cards that are just generally good when you have creatures in play. Things like Concordant Crossroads to give all creatures haste, or Spider Silk Armor to give all of the creatures reach. Things that modify the tokens that get dumped into play from the deck. And every turn, the Horde deck just flips cards off the top until they hit a real magic card, and all of those tokens and the magic card come into play. The cool thing about this is that you can adjust the power level of the deck by changing which tokens are included. If you're including some of those kind of weirder tokens like Merit Lage, 20/20 Flying Indestructible, or just 1/1 Saprolings, obviously this is going to be dramatic shifts in power. And for the other cards in the deck, you can range from something simple, like I said with Gaia's Anthem, to something very terrifying like Cathar's Crusade that can really change the tide of battle. And so depending on what group you're playing with, your Horde deck can change as well. And it's a really fun way to sit down with players and not actively face off against each other. It's good for learning the game because you can have more experienced players on your side while you're getting the hang of your deck, but it also makes for a really fun challenge for some of these higher powered decks if you really juice the power of that Horde deck. I highly recommend it. But let's move on from 3 players and say we have a few too many. What do we do at a 5-player table? So what can we do if we have 1 extra player? You can play a 5-player game of Commander, but like I said before, some of the effects get a little more powerful. And other decks aren't going to be able to deal the 160 damage you need to eliminate another 4 people at the table. So let's go back to an old format. I remember playing this back in 2002, 2003. And you would do it when you had exactly 5 people at the table. It's called Star Magic. And if you look at the back of a magic card, you can see the 5 little points around the star. In the past, the points next to each other were called allied colors, and the points away across the star were called enemy colors. And so when you play Star Magic, you have allies and enemies, and every point at the table has exactly 2 enemies that they are trying to eliminate. This means that in some cases, you have an ally sitting next to you that are planning on teaming up against the one person across the way. But in other cases, they need to keep that person alive, at least temporarily, to stop you from winning the game, because your other target is already eliminated. It's a really cool way to focus people on specific opponents that they need to defeat. It eases up on some of that decision paralysis of who you can attack and who you shouldn't, and the wheeling and dealing that sometimes happens in these types of games. Now, with only 2 opponents to eliminate, the game becomes a little more streamlined. And you might not be eliminated and still lose the game, because 2 other players went out before you. It's a really fun way to play the game, and it does shake up some of the player dynamics at larger tables. I'd highly recommend trying it out, even if you do have 4 players available. Adding that 5th player makes for a really unique experience, and it's a lot of fun. But there's one more format that we can play at exactly 5 players, and that's Kingdoms. Now, Kingdoms is a really interesting 5-player format. The idea is that each of the 5 players at the table has a specific role with specific goals that they are trying to accomplish. Certain decks will perform better in certain roles, but the roles are randomized at the start of the game. So each player is going to be given a basic land at random, and depending on what land you get, you are going to find yourself in a different role. Let's go over what the roles do. The first is the king, the monarch. And as such, you start with that card face up. You have the monarch in play, you reveal yourself at the beginning of the game, and you start at an extra 10 life. Additionally, you always go first. So this gives you every opportunity to get ahead before the rest of the table can get online. Because as you'll find out, a few of the other roles kind of want to do you in. But you have a little bit of a backup. The next role we're going to talk about is the knight. And the knight's whole goal is to keep you alive, eliminate the other 3 people at the table, and as long as the monarch is alive at the end of the game, the knight wins. So the knight and the monarch are in this game together. But now, let's move on to the adversaries in this scenario. First, you have the assassin. The assassin wants to take out the monarch at all costs, but be careful. If you reveal yourself too early, the monarch and the knight might come after you and get you off the table before you have a chance to do anything. Then we have the bandit. The bandit wants to see the world burn. The bandit wants to be the last one alive at the table, and their only win condition is eliminating all 4 other players. This means early on in the game, the bandit tends to pretend to be the knight, or at least work in a similar capacity, because the assassin needs to go before the monarch, or the assassin's going to win before the bandit gets to take the hall. And finally, we have the usurper. Now, the usurper takes the place of the monarch. If the usurper can deal the killing blow on the monarch, even if the assassin is still on the table, the usurper takes the monarch's place. Now, in this case, the game continues as normal. But the usurper is the new monarch, and now joins the knight in trying to eliminate the other 2 players at the table. There's a lot of politicking and a lot of discussion in this. It's a game that works well for the people that want even more wheeling and dealing at the table. It has a certain amount of hidden information, and nobody's allowed to reveal their role until the game is over. Now, there's variations to these rules, and I'm sure people have their own ways of playing or recommendations for making this particular format better. If you've tried it before, I'd love to hear how your experience was, but let's add another person to the mix. What do we do when we have 6 players at the table? So with 6 people at the table, I think there's really only one format you can play. But fortunately, it makes the game a lot faster. It's kind of a combination of Star Magic and Kingdoms, because what you are doing is separating into 2 teams, 3v3. And you can randomly draw these or roll dice for positions around the table, but then you decide amongst yourselves who's going to be the emperor. And this format is called emperors. Each person has an emperor and 2 guardsmen, or whatever you want to call them, sitting on either side of them. Now, the guards have an effective range of 1, meaning the guards will be fighting only the other guards, without access to the emperor until one of the guards is slain. The emperors have an effective range of 2, which means they can interact past their guards, attacking both of the guards on either side. There's variations of this that also allow the emperor to pass creatures to either of their guards, but I think you can skip that, and it seems like an added layer of complexity that isn't really necessary if you just say that the emperor has a range of 2. Again, in this format, you want to focus on the elimination of your opponent's side of the board, and the game is only won when the opposing emperor is defeated. So by eliminating one guard and pushing through to defeat the emperor, you can close out the game. But at that same time, your opponent is pushing in on you. Each player has their own life total, and as the game progresses, you'll see some interesting interactions, especially with global effects, because you only have that effective range of 1. I played Emperors a lot, way back when 60-card Magic was the de facto casual format, and it was a really good way to take odd numbers of people and kind of get them into a game, and by putting people strategically on different teams, again, you can put someone who's new to Magic next to somebody who really knows what they're doing and make for a good first experience into the game. My only caution with doing something like that is backseat play can sometimes be a little annoying, so avoid that if possible. I'd say just as a general rule in Magic, avoid telling other people which moves they should make or which moves they can make, at least until after the game is over. But what if we have more than 6? Well, at some point, we get up into 2 full tables of Commander. And if we're playing with 7 players at the table, that's not really any different than 4 players and 3 players at 2 tables. But there are ways of playing with that many people at the same table. So now let's get into playing Magic with more than 6 people. Let's say you have a large dining table. 10 people showed up to play Magic, and you don't really want to break off into separate groups because you want to all be part of the same gameplay experience. Unfortunately, the reality is, as people get eliminated, the game's going to keep going for a while. And so this is where we bring in the Grand Melee. This format allows multiple people to be taking their turns at the same time, at different points in the table. As a general rule, you leave a couple spaces between the people who are actively taking their turns, and those spaces will change based on how many people are playing at the table. If you're playing with 7, you're probably going to have an active player, 2 blank spaces, and another active player. And those people will pass their turns together. And if one person ends early, they have to wait until the other person completes their turn as well. This continues around the table. Everyone has an effective range of 1, meaning you are only interacting with your immediate neighbors on both how you're attacking and what your spells can do, and as people get eliminated, those turns might collapse. And so by the time you get down to 3 or 4 players left, typically you're only going to have one person taking their turn. It makes for a kind of unique experience and really allows you to have one person stand supreme over the rest of everybody at the table. And when you start getting later in the game, those powerful players that are eliminating players have to face off. It's a cool way of having an elimination tournament without having people feel like they got paired up unfairly. I just think it's a really cool way to close out a weekend and get everyone together for one last hurrah. Typically though, you're always going to be better off pairing off into small tables and having that unique gameplay experience, seeing each deck highlighted in its own way, sometimes with a unique role or added rules in place, whatever you need to do to make the game play interesting and fun. If you have other formats that you play with weird pod sizes, let me know, because I'm always looking for new ways to play the game and would love to hear about your experience with some of the formats that I mentioned in this video. Nope. Nope. Okay. Hey, buddy. No, we're not doing this. We're not doing this. Okay. You're gonna go. Yeah. Cat token got loose.